Morning. It's good to be back.
Morning.
We are in Numbers chapter 20 this morning, I believe. And unless Keith, did you go past chapter 19, or you just reviewed last week? All right. So Numbers chapter 20 this morning, and pretty much Numbers chapters 20 and 21 are basically another transition, similar to what we had in chapters 11 and 12. What we got is a journey narrative where Israel moves between two locations. And in this case, they're moving from their wilderness wanderings in Kadesh to their eventual final camp at Moab, which is the last place they camp before they enter the Promised Land. And so what we have here in chapter 20 is the death of two important characters, Miriam and Aaron, as well as what is a prediction of Moses' death, which we'll read in a second. So picking up in verse 1, the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. There was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. The people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us into this wretched place? It is not a place of grains or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink." So Moses took the rock from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you have not believed me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. All right, well, first of all, this section here kicks off with Miriam's death. Miriam is actually only mentioned by name 3 times in the whole law of Moses, and this is the 3rd time, and it's her death. So she's actually not mentioned by name in Exodus whenever she's watching over Moses and when his mother puts him in the basket in the river. But it's interesting to note that this is foreshadowing the death of what's going to happen next. But in verses 2 through 13, we have really the central event of the story. And what does it remind us of? Where have we seen this before? Exodus 17, yeah, well really 1 through 7, and because you got all these intentional echoes from chapter 17 of Exodus. The people complain about water. God provides them water. God provides them water from a rock. The place name is even the same. In Exodus 17:7, they named that place Meribah. And they named this place Meribah too. Meribah means contention. It's a reference to the fact that they contended with the Lord there. And really, later on in the Old Testament, there's one of the Psalms that cites Meribah as the failure to enter the Promised Land. In Psalm 95, where it says, "Today, if you would hear His voice," I'm starting in the middle of verse 7, "Today, if you would hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as in the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation. And they said, they are a people who err in their heart, and they do not know my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger, truly they shall not enter into my rest." Now, which Meribah is it talking about in that psalm? Well, probably both of them at the same time. I think it's intentionally ambiguous. But the fact of the matter is that Meribah is just one example of the people's behavior. And we're supposed to think of Exodus 17 when we read Numbers 20, because of how similar the events are. Now, Let me ask you another question. What's the difference between Exodus 17 and what happens here? What are some of the differences?
Okay,
there's a key difference right there. Well, I mean, first of all, this account mentions Moses and Aaron. Exodus 17 only mentioned Moses. In this account, the people's complaint includes the fact that their brothers perished from before the Lord. That wasn't there before. There's a fact that the rod was taken from before the Lord, from before Yahweh, which is a reference to Numbers 17, where they had the rod in His presence. And God commands Moses to speak to the rock instead of striking the rock. So there's a difference there. Don, you have something.
No, I'm glad you suppose that Moses being a bit presumptive. Well, he hadn't struck the rock before, and that's why he struck the rock again.
Well, that's actually the next question. What did Moses do here that deserves punishment? But
obviously disobedience.
Well, okay, disobedience.
God said, speak to the rock. Takes the rod and hits the rock.
Okay, all right. All right, so we have Moses. God said to do one thing, Moses did a different thing, right? And water still comes out of the rock, interestingly enough. But God says, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the people, you're not going to enter the promised land. Now, Jenna, you look like you had something.
You already said it.
Oh, okay. Now, let me ask you something. Is that the only thing that Moses does wrong here? Don.
Well, just one more thought regarding that. Moses striking the rock and what he had to say as he was doing that or afterwards, trying to glory to himself instead of God.
Aha! And there's the key to this. Sometimes I think we focus on the fact that Moses struck the rock. God told him to speak to it, so disobedience, right? But I think we in doing that miss a very critical part of why Moses is disobedient. Well, why was Moses disobedient? Look at what he says. Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Who's bringing water out of the rock? God is. But Moses claims we. And in fact, he assigns a glory to himself on this particular occasion. And I know for a fact that this is how we should interpret this story because it's the way that the psalmist interprets it in Psalm 106. In Psalm 106, in verses 32 and 33, it says, "They also provoked him to wrath at the waters of Meribah, so that it went hard with Moses on their account. Because they were rebellious against his spirit, he spoke rashly with his lips." What Moses says on this occasion is called by the psalmist speaking rashly. He spoke rash words. He sinned in making this statement. And so the meekest man on the face of the earth, from chapter 12 and verse 3, is undone by pride. Don.
I think, in fact, I know that there's a huge lesson for all of us in being self-glorious instead of assigning glory to God for the things we have. Any aspect of our lives need to glorify God with instead of, well, yeah, it's me. Well, it's not. It's God.
Right.
If God's working in us, that's what we're going to be good.
Right. And I mean, ultimately, pride, I think, leads to disobedience in this instance. And, so it's not just that he didn't do exactly what God said, but the whole attitude that led to that is even further what is wrong with this picture. The implicit lesson from this is that attitude and behavior go hand in hand with each other. Now, just looking at that, Moses doesn't speak to the rock. He does speak to somebody, though. Who does he speak? He speaks to the people. He speaks to the people, and then he strikes the rock. And even though the expression, just as the Lord commanded, is used in verse 9 about taking the rod, it's not used anywhere after that, which implies that Moses has departed in some sense from what God commanded. And throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, what Moses did is classified as outright rebellion. In verse 24 of the same chapter, Aaron will be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the sons of Israel, because you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Again, in chapter 27, in verse 14, it says, in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to treat me as holy before their eyes at the water. These are the waters of Meribah, of Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin. What Moses did was rebellion. And so his punishment is that he can't enter the promised land. As I swore in my wrath, in the words of Psalm 95, he shall not enter my rest. And that psalm applies to Moses as well. Now, this adds up. Yes, Don?
Another thought about it. All this, from the time that they left Egypt to this point in time, Moses has been dealing with all kinds of stuff with these guys. The golden calf, and the cinnamon, and the plans, and outright sin and stuff. And it's kind of surprising how Moses has reacted to it all up to this point. Because he's got to be getting fed up. God's fed up. You can see that how God responds to the people. Yeah, I'm going to destroy them. We read about that several times. And Moses talks about it.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's, from a humble point of view, chapter 12 and verse 3,
Up to this point.
I'm certain afterwards, wow.
Pride is it's interesting how pride is the undoing of the meekest man on the face of the earth. There's another angle to this though too. The book of Hebrews cites this event in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, and it, again, quotes from the 95th Psalm. Psalm 95 is really at the center of this whole thing. But one of the things the Hebrew author says in Hebrews 3 is that Christ is greater than Moses. He says in verse 3 of chapter 3, he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses by just so much as the builder of the house is more honored than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. So he says, we need to hold fast if we want to, be regarded of faithfulness. But then he quotes from Psalm 95 and goes, by the way, Christ is greater than Moses, but are we really greater than Israel? Israel didn't enter God's rest because of the way they acted at Meribah. Israel didn't enter God's rest because of the way they rebelled against Him. Moses didn't even enter God's rest because of his behavior. So the question is, are we going to be greater or not? Are we going to fall into the same trap that they did? Take care, brethren, in verse 12, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. Just as Moses did not believe God to treat him as holy in the sight of Israel, well, we don't believe God to treat him as holy. What's going to happen to us? Encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin, for we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. And on we could go, and we don't have the time to really flesh out the Hebrew author's argument here. The big gist of... Let me ask something. Those of you that were in my Hebrew class several years ago, what is the whole point of the book of Hebrews? Don't quit. Don't quit. That's his point. He goes back and he appeals to this event and says, don't quit. Now, looking at all of that, there's another statement here in verses 12 through 13 of Numbers 20. What does this say about God's holiness? In verse 12, in verse 12, what does it say about the holiness? Moses didn't treat him as holy. What does it say in verse 13 about his holiness? He proved himself holy. Even though Moses failed to treat God as holy, God still proved himself holy among them. This is very similar to something we saw in Leviticus, isn't it? In Leviticus chapter 10 and verses 1 through 3. Whenever Nadab and Abihu were consumed after they offered fire which the Lord had not commanded, Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke." Verse 3, saying, "By those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. And before all the people, I will be honored." So Aaron therefore kept silent. Now, what is the point of that? I will be treated as holy. Now, you're going to treat me as holy in one of two ways. You're either going to do it willingly by doing what I said and obeying me, or I'm going to have to demonstrate my holiness in a different way, in judgment. And that's in the case with Nadab and Abihu. And Nadab and Abihu showed that God was holy. They didn't do it by what they did. They showed it by what was done to them. When God consumed, and it's the same thing here with Moses. God shows himself holy by producing water from the rock, but he shows himself even more holy by saying, "Moses, because you did not treat me as holy, you are no longer part of the promise. You are no longer permitted to enter the promised land." He does grant Moses the concession later. You can see it from the top of Mount Nebo, but you can't go into it. And we read about that in Deuteronomy 34. So, that's in a nutshell what happens at the waters of Meribah. Any comments or questions? Moving on, verse 14 of Numbers 20. From Kadesh, Moses then sent messengers to the king of Edom. "Thus your brother Israel has said, you know all the hardship that has befallen us, that our fathers went down to Egypt, and we stayed in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians treated us and our fathers badly. But when we cried out to the Lord, He heard our voice and sent an angel and brought us out from Egypt. Now, behold, we are at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. Please, let us pass through your land. We will not pass through field or vineyard. We will not even drink water from a well. We will go along the king's highway, not turning to the right or left until we pass through your territory." Edom, however, said to him, "You shall not pass through us, or I will come out with the sword against you." Again, the sons of Israel said to him, "We will go up by the highway, and if I and my livestock do drink any of your water, I will pay its price. Let me only pass through on my feet, nothing else." But he said, "You shall not pass through." And Edom came out against him with a heavy force and a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to allow Israel to pass through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. So, what's happening here? What's the reason for all of this? I guess more to the point, why does Israel not respond? Well, why does Israel just sort of cave into what Edom says to do here?
Because of the show of force.
Okay, there's a show of force, right? Now, the beginning of this is Israel giving a description of their hardships, There's no mention of the reasons why they need to pass through or where they're going or whatnot. And they request, let us pass through your land. And Edom says, "Well, no, we're going to fight you." And Israel says, well, let us pass through your land. We'll compensate you if we take anything. And they say no, and they actually use military force. They make good on their threat. And so Israel winds up going around Edom. Well, let's ask a bigger question. Who is Edom? What is Edom? Jenna? Esau's descendants. Okay, all right. And what is Israel's relationship with Edom? Guess that would make them cousins, yes, all right. How are they supposed to act towards each other? Does God have anything to say on that matter?
The older will serve the younger. The older will serve the younger.
Okay, the older will serve the younger. Okay, so Edom is ultimately supposed to be subjugated to Israel. There's more to it than that. Did God... Well, let me ask you something. Could Israel have picked a fight with Edom? Could they have fought them and won?
Yes.
Why didn't they? Why not?
Edom was never promised any mercy from God.
Right, but why wasn't? Well, let's look at another passage. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. And this is a retelling of this story with some extra details. We turned and set out for the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spoke to me, and circled Mount Seir for many days. The Lord spoke to me, saying, You've circled this mountain long enough. Now turn north and command the people, saying, You will pass through the territory of your brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir. And they will be afraid of you, so be very careful. Do not provoke them, for I will not give you any of their land, even as little as a footstep, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. So we see that God actually had a promised land for Edom as well. It's a different kind of promised land, but He gave it to them anyway. He says in verse 6, You shall buy food from them and with money so that you may eat. You shall also purchase water from them with money so that you may drink. For the Lord your God has blessed you in all that you have done. He has known your wanderings through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked a thing. So we passed beyond our brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Arabah road, together with Elath, and from Ezion Geber. And we turned and passed through by the way of the wilderness of Moab. So God's point here is you don't pick a fight with Edom, because I've given that land to Edom. I have not given it to you. You go around them. And implicit in all of this is the fact that, well, they're your brothers. You're not supposed to pick fights with them. Now, later on in the Old Testament, in the book of Obadiah in particular, the nation of Edom is indicted because they did not treat Israel as they should. In the little book of Obadiah, in the book of Obadiah, in verse 6, How Esau will be ransacked and his hidden treasures searched out. All the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overtake you. They who eat your bread will set an ambush for you. There's no understanding in him. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau, that your mighty men will be dismayed, O Teman, so that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. Because of, verse 10, of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gate, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. And he goes on, begins describing, in detail, things that they're not supposed to do, which they really did anyway. I take Obadiah to be written around the time of Jerusalem's destruction in 587 by Nebuchadnezzar, and Edomites' involvement in that. But basically, in a nutshell, the point is that God holds nations accountable for their interactions with one another. And particularly, these two nations are supposed to get along. God has a certain degree of peace that He wants them to keep with each other. And when they don't keep that peace, He holds them accountable for it. He holds them accountable for their cruelty to one another. So the sword cuts both ways. Israel's not allowed to harm Edom. Edom's not really allowed to harm Israel either. Any comments or questions on that? That's a lot of stuff to throw out at once. And we could, really the whole study of Edom and who they were and what they represent in the Scripture is a lesson in and of itself, which we will not do today. But just look at that sometime. Go through and look at all the passages that talk about Edom. Verse 22. Now when they set out from Kadesh, the sons of Israel, the whole congregation came to Mount Hor. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron at Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron will be gathered to his people. He shall not enter the land which I have given to the sons of Israel, because you have rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up to Mount Hor. Strip Aaron of his garments and put them on his son Eleazar, so Aaron will be gathered to his people, and will die there. So Moses did just as the Lord had commanded. They went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. After Moses had stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on his son Eleazar, Aaron died there on the mountaintop. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. When all the congregation saw that Aaron had died, all the house of Israel wept for Aaron 30 days. Alright, so why is this event important? Well, what's significant about this event? Jenna? The high priest is gone, so they have a new one, okay? What we see here, Aaron dies at Mount Hor. It's also called Masera in Deuteronomy 10:6. Aaron's 123 years old. That's a long time to live. It says that he was gathered to his people. That's basically an idiom for death. Aaron's death, though, means a new high priest, like Jenna said. The death of a high priest means the end of an era. Later on in the book of Numbers, we find out whenever the high priest died, the cities of refuge could release those who were staying in them, basically. So that signals the forgiveness of manslaughter as well. The death of a high priest is cited by the Hebrew author in Hebrews chapter 7 as an imperfection in the law. The former priests were prevented by death from continuing, as contrasted with Jesus, who is our high priest, who never dies. Now Eleazar is ordained as the new high priest, just as the Lord commanded. This statement, just as the Lord commanded, implies that even though disobedience is what causes Aaron's death, obedience is what characterizes it. So there's another good point to make. Aaron dies on top of a mountain in the sight of all the people. The people mourn for 30 days. Yes, Jenna?
I thought it was interesting that they were allowed to mourn for him after he disobeyed. They weren't supposed to mourn for Nadab and Abihu.
Well, and they mourned for Moses for 30 days too, actually, if you look at the end of Deuteronomy 34. It's just that it's a way of expressing Aaron's importance to them, because Aaron was important. He was their anointed high priest, and you think about it, Aaron, there's a lot of times in Scripture where Aaron does stuff that you're kind of like, really? I mean, like the business with the golden calf. Deuteronomy says that God was angry enough to destroy Aaron on that occasion. He was angry enough to destroy him, and yet, he didn't. He showed mercy to him. And Aaron is constantly being shown mercy. The fact that Aaron even became high priest is itself a demonstration of God's grace. The fact that we're able to become priests in the presence of God is also a demonstration of His grace. We're no better than Aaron was. Let's get that straight. There's a lesson in that, I think. People mourn for 30 days, which normally when somebody mourned to death, they mourned for 7 days, but 30 is a way of expressing importance. There's several parallels between Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34 and Aaron's death here in Numbers 20. Both of them took place on a mountain. Neither leader could enter the promised land. Both of them had mourning that lasted for 30 days, and both of them have a ceremony where leadership is transferred. In Aaron's case, it was from himself to Eleazar, and in Moses' case, it was from Moses to Joshua. Any comments or questions on the death of Aaron? You all understand it perfectly, and you've made every point that could possibly be made. Jenna, yes?
I guess they also did that ceremony thing. The clothes wouldn't be unclean.
So the what?
The clothes wouldn't be unclean.
The clothes wouldn't be unclean? Well, yeah, that's the thing. If he dies in the high priestly garments, I guess that they're unclean, aren't they? That's a good point to make, I suppose. Because, contact with a corpse means defilement and uncleanness. And we saw that in Numbers 19. It's a good point to bring out. It's interesting that all of this happens right on the heels of the law about how to deal with contact with the dead, actually, in chapter 19. There's another connection I hadn't considered, but there you go. Chapter 21. When the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming by the way of Atharim, then he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. So Israel made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities." The Lord heard the voice of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities. Thus the name of that place was called Hormah. So who gets defeated here and why? Ask you, is there anything significant about those verses right there? It's a short little story, but there's an important detail you need to notice. Where does it happen?
I think the most important detail is that they sought the Lord.
Right. Okay, they sought the Lord. That is important. You're right. Let me ask you something. This happened at Hormah. Have we ever seen Hormah before? Well, in the book of Numbers, have we ever seen this place mentioned before? I've never seen Hormah either. It's actually a word play on the word for total destruction, Haram. But, yes, Jenna?
It's where they got beaten last time.
Aha! Back in chapter 14. In chapter 4...
At least they got kicked out that far.
Well, yeah, in chapter 14 in verse 45, whenever they make an ill-fated attempt to enter the promised land, the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and struck them and beat them down as far as Hormah. So they were defeated at Hormah 40 years ago. But here, 40 years later, they win a victory. Why do they win? What's the difference between those two circumstances? Don already said it. It's because they sought the Lord. Because they were doing this... Israel fights this battle because some captives have been taken from them. They make a vow to devote those cities to destruction, place them under the ban, the cherem. And so there, the first of many Canaanite conquests to come happens here at Arad. Any comments or questions? All right. Verse 4. Then they set out from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient because of the journey. The people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this miserable food. Kind of a contradiction there. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many of the people of Israel died. So the people came to Moses and said, "We've sinned because we have spoken against the Lord, and you intercede with the Lord that He may remove the serpents from us." Moses interceded for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent, and set it on a standard. It will come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live." Moses made a bronze serpent, set it on the standard, and it came about that if a serpent bit any man, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. Okay, so why is this event significant? What would we say about Israel's character here?
They confess their sins.
Okay, yeah, but Jenna?
They just got done asking God for help and then they complained.
Yeah, it seems like they are a little bit fickle, and their character hasn't changed much since chapter 11 and chapter 14, and even chapter 20, really. Don?
They
Became impatient.
Have we heard that before?
Now, in Exodus and in Numbers 11, whenever people complain, "God, we don't have any food. God, we don't have any water," what did God usually do for them? He took care of them. He provided them with bread and water. That's not what He does this time. What's He do instead? He sends fiery serpents to destroy them. Yes. And so that is what happens here. And there's a further irony here. The serpent is a symbol of Lower Egypt. Well, it's a symbol of power in Lower Egypt. And so God's basically kind of saying, if you want Egypt back, well, here you go, serpents. This is the last time in the Old Law that we have a complaint about food. Israel finally has the audacity to come out and say, not only are we, do we have no food and water, but we don't even like the food we've got. We don't even like the manna. 40 years of this and we've had enough, and I mean, we're probably not any better because, how many of you can eat the same thing for every day of the week, much less 40 years?
You see a bit of a contradiction here?
Yeah.
We have no food or water. This food we're eating is miserable.
Yeah, exactly.
And like you just said, you don't have any food.
We don't have any food.
It's not something we want.
Right, and it's their God is their appetite. Jenna, you had something?
I was just saying,
She really could eat the same meal every day of the week, but it's not manna, it's spaghetti. So,
after a while.
You would get tired of it after a while, and yes, everybody would. Even if it's the bread of angels we're talking about here, and they still got tired of it. Okay, so. It is interesting, this is all echoed in the days of Jesus whenever the Jews reject the true bread of heaven that comes down, Jesus Christ Himself. James?
It's kind of interesting here, God uses a bronze serpent kind of like an idol.
We're going to get to that, but yeah.
Okay.
Well, no. Well, no, go ahead, make your point.
Well, I was just going to say that, it's like in Exodus when Aaron made the golden calf. It's the complete opposite of that. So.
It is the complete opposite. Well, the solution that God proposes here is, make a copper serpent or a bronze serpent, however you translate it, and everybody that looks at it's going to live. And, there's nothing inherently magical about the snake. So the real issue here is one of trust. And even though snakes were unclean animals, even though snakes were associated with sin, even though the devil takes the form of a snake, the pollutant used correctly can still save. There's also a wordplay between the snake, nakash, and the copper, nakashat, and later on in... well, let me just ask you, what happens to this bronze serpent? Is this the last time in the Bible we see it? Hezekiah destroys it. Why did Hezekiah destroy it?
The idols in the high place.
And what were people doing with the serpent? They were worshiping it. Yes, they were treating it so it actually became an idol. In 2 Kings 18:4, you can read about Nehushtan, another play on the word for snake, and a good thing gone wrong. So when a good thing goes bad, what does they do? Well, what do? They destroy it. Hezekiah destroys the idol from this time in the wilderness. There's one other significant thing about this serpent, the time we got left. Is this serpent mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, besides the two passages we just mentioned? I know Jenna knows.
John, right?
Yes! John chapter 3, whenever Jesus is having his conversation with Nicodemus, Jesus references the serpent. And this is the context of that famous verse 16, but one of the things here, he says, I'll start in verse 12. If I told you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven, but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that whoever believes will in him have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. He who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe in him has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. And he goes on from there describing things. But he uses the serpent Moses lifted up in the wilderness to to use himself as an example. What does Jesus mean when he talks about being lifted up? What's that referring to? Yes. Jenna. His crucifixion. The Gospel of John, Jesus is mentioned being lifted up several times, and in every single one of them he is referring to the exact manner and how he is going to die. In John 6, does this cause you to stumble? What then when you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? In John 8 and verse 28, Jesus said, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am, and I do nothing on my own initiative, but I speak these things as my Father taught me. In John chapter 12 and verse 32, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. The Gospel of John being lifted up is always clearly a reference to his crucifixion. And so the connection with the Moses story is made clear. That just as Moses lifted up the serpent, so Jesus will be lifted up. And just as all who look to the serpent were saved, so all who look to Jesus, who trust in Jesus, will be saved. This is an issue of trust. It's why he says, God so loved the world that he gave his only unique Son, so that everyone who trusts in him will not perish, but will have eternal life. And typologically, the real serpent is out to destroy us, Satan. But if we look to the one that is lifted up, then the serpent has no power over us. We have more to say on chapter 21, but we're going to have to call it here. And if anybody has anything they want to add, now would be a good time to throw it in. No? All right. We will pick up next time in chapter 21. I guess we're going to be defeating Sihon and Og this time. So